The Vikings were feared for their raids, their ships, their gods, but nothing struck terror like their cruelest form of punishment. A torture whispered in sagas, so brutal that even warriors trembled at its mention. Flesh was torn, breath stolen, and the victim's agony became a warning to all who defied the law. This was no simple death, it was suffering crafted to break both body and spirit. Today, we reveal the Viking torture of indescribable horror. The frost lay heavy upon the fjords, stilling even the breath of the sea, and in that frozen silence the people gathered. Word had spread through longhouses and mead halls that this day they would witness something beyond the common cruelties of war or feud. Viking men had been slain with axe and sword, women had wailed over burning homesteads, and Viking children had been carried from the smoke of raids. But this was different. This was no quick blow of iron, no clean fall upon the earth. What they would see whispered through the night fires as a Viking torture of indescribable horror, a punishment feared even by the fiercest warriors who had stared death in the face. The condemned man was dragged across the brittle ground, iron chains rattling against the frozen stones. His breath came in clouds, white against the winter sky, and his feet left streaks of blood on the snow. He had once been a Viking man of standing, bold in the shield wall, but treachery had brought him here. Oathbreaker, kin betrayer, thief of trust names, spat upon him as he was hauled before the thing. The assembly did not shout nor jeer. They watched in grim silence, their eyes hard, for in this moment judgment was not the work of men but of the gods. The chieftain stood tall by the great stone, his furs lined with frost, and raised his hand to quiet the murmur of the crowd. Behind him the skald clutched his staff, ready to etch the tale into memory. No horn blew, no weapon clashed, only the cold wind spoke. "Let him be bound," the chieftain commanded, his voice carrying across the field. And so the condemned was lashed, wrists twisted by rope, ankles cut by iron, dragged toward the place none dared name aloud. It lay on the edge of the forest, where the pines bent low, their needles crusted with ice. There the ground dipped into shadow, and from that hollow rose a tree scarred by centuries. Its trunk was split and hollowed, blackened with soot, as if the gods themselves had struck it with fire. The old women muttered that this was no mere tree, but a vessel of punishment, a dungeon of wood, carved by men, yet consecrated by fear. Children clung to their mothers, peeking from beneath woolen cloaks, their wide eyes fixed on the bound figure. Viking food had been scarce that winter, the land harsh, and hunger had hollowed their faces, but still they came to see. For this punishment was not only for the guilty man, it was for every soul of the village, a reminder that even among warriors there were things more dreadful than death on the battlefield. As the prisoner was dragged closer, his strength broke, and he stumbled into the snow. The guards wrenched him upright, forcing his head back so that he saw the hollow gaping before him. His lips cracked in the cold, muttering words none could hear, whether curses or prayers. The chieftain gave no mercy, no pause. He spoke of the betrayal, of kin's blood spilled by greedy hands, of oaths shattered like ice on stone. Then he turned to the gathered folk. "This is justice. Let all who see remember." The skald's voice lifted, half chant, half lament, carrying the story to the gods. Ravens circled overhead, black wings against the pale sky, as though Odin himself had sent them to bear witness. The condemned man was thrust forward, pressed toward the tree's dark maw. The crowd did not cheer. They shivered, for even hardened warriors felt the weight of what was to come. A Viking torture of indescribable horror awaited, and in that frostbitten silence, every heart beat heavy with fear, knowing that the line between man and corpse, honour and disgrace, was thinner than the ice beneath their feet. The long winter sun slanted low across the fjord, throwing long shadows over the gathering. The air was brittle, sharp enough to bite the lungs, yet the people came, wrapped in cloaks of fur and wool, their boots crunching upon the frozen ground. This was no feast day, no call to arms, but the summoning of the thing, the ancient assembly, where law was spoken and doom decreed. In that ring of stone and frost, a Viking man's fate would be sealed, and the torment reserved for oath-breakers revealed. At the heart of the circle stood the condemned. His wrists were bound with hemp, the rope stiff with ice. His beard was matted, his eyes wild, but there was no pity in the crowd that ringed him. Men who had once rode beside him now spat upon the ground. Women who had once shared Viking food with him turned their faces away. Even Viking children, clinging to their mothers' skirts, felt the weight of the day, whispering in hushed tones about the punishment no one wished to name aloud. The law speaker raised his staff, carved with runes of old. His voice rolled out like thunder on the still air. Here stands an outlaw, breaker of oaths sworn upon iron and fire. He has betrayed his kin, stained the honour of his chieftain, and spit upon the word of the gods. His words cut deeper than any blade, for in the Northlands a broken oath was a wound that bled forever. No man who shattered it could hope for peace in life or in death. The chieftain stepped forward, his cloak of wolf fur swaying heavy on his shoulders. His face was hard, carved by winters and wars. He looked upon the prisoner as though gazing at carrion left for ravens. You sought gold over honour, silver over kin. You thought yourself cunning, but the gods see all, and so do men. His hand lifted, gesturing toward the forest's edge where the punishment tree stood. Its blackened trunk loomed against the white snow, a dark mouth waiting to swallow the condemned. A murmur passed through the crowd, not of dissent, but of dread. Everyone knew what lay ahead. The torture was older than memory, a punishment whispered of by firesides but rarely seen. It was said that those who endured it lingered between death and life, forgotten by the living, cursed by the gods, their cries carried on the wind until their throats broke. It was not meant to kill quickly. It was meant to erase, to turn a man into nothing. The skald, keeper of memory, raised his voice, his chant weaving sorrow with judgment. He named the man's crimes again, binding them in words so they could never be washed away. His song was not for mercy, but for remembrance, that future generations would know the price of betrayal. Ravens croaked from the trees beyond, their wings shaking snow from the branches, and the people nodded, taking it as a sign. The outlaw's gaze swept over the faces around him, seeking some flicker of compassion. None met his eyes. He was no longer a man, but a shadow, already dead in their hearts. He spat in the snow, defiant, but his shoulders trembled as the guards gripped him and pulled him forward. The ropes cut deeper into his flesh, each step dragging him closer to the hollow tree and the terror bound within. The law speaker lowered his staff, his final words heavy as stone. Let him be taken. Let his breath be weighed in the dark. Let his soul be judged by the gods he has mocked. This is the law of the thing. And with that, the condemned was led away, stumbling over ice, while the assembly broke apart in grim silence. None spoke of mercy, none turned back, for they all knew that oath-breakers had no place among the living, and the horror awaiting him was justice in its most merciless form. The tide had withdrawn from the fjord, leaving behind a stretch of black mud glazed with ice. It was upon this shore that the condemned was dragged, the clatter of his chains echoing louder than the gulls that wheeled overhead. The iron links bit into his flesh, raw skin torn open where the metal scraped bone. He stumbled, fell, and was yanked upright again, his knees striking the frozen ground with a crack that made even the hard-faced warriors flinch. Still, none moved to ease his suffering. For a Viking man who had betrayed oath and kin, compassion was as distant as summer. The people lined the shore, their cloaks drawn tight against the biting wind. Mothers held Viking children close, shielding their eyes yet knowing they would peek between fingers, for this was a lesson as much as a spectacle. Betrayal could not be spoken away, nor washed with silver. It had to be dragged through mud, paraded beneath the gaze of the gods and broken before the eyes of all. Old men leaned upon their staffs, silent, their mouths grim lines. Women muttered prayers into the folds of their shawls. Even the young warriors, eager for glory in battle, stood hushed, as if the sea itself demanded reverence. The prisoner gasped against the cold, each breath a plume of frost. His hair was stiff with ice, his lips cracked and bloody. His body was broad once, a Viking warrior fit for shield and oar, but chains had stripped him of strength, leaving him to stagger like a broken beast. Behind him, the guards pulled hard, forcing him forward through the sludge where brine stung the open wounds on his feet. The iron rang over the stones, a sound sharp and merciless, echoing back from the cliffs. At the water's edge, the tide lapped at his ankles, numbing him further. He fell face first into the freezing shallows, his mouth filling with salt and grit. The guards let him choke a moment before hauling him upright again, dragging him through muck and ice until he collapsed at the feet of the assembly gathered upon higher ground. Every step of his torment was meant to strip away dignity, to show all who watched that an oathbreaker was lower than the lowest thrall. A skald raised his voice, reciting his shame, the verses rolling across the shore like thunder. He spoke of feasts where this man had once eaten Viking food beside his brothers, of raids where he had stood proud in the prow of the ship, shouting with the fury of the storm. He named the turning of his heart, the betrayal whispered in dark corners, the greed that had led him astray. With each verse, the people spat upon the ground, marking their disgust. The prisoner's head lolled, his eyes red with cold and pain, yet he heard every word. His breathing rasped, his body shaking not only from the chill, but from the knowledge that his name would be carried in shame across generations. No sword thrust could wound a Viking soul so deep as the loss of honour. Ravens gathered on the rocks, their black wings stark against the pale sky, croaking their harsh approval. To many in the crowd, it was a sign that Odin himself bore witness. The condemned would not enter Valhalla, no matter how many battles he had fought, no matter how many ships he had helped steer into war. He was cut off, abandoned, already half in hell's grasp. The guards tightened their grip and lifted him once more. Mud streaked his face, iron clattered against stone, and blood dripped onto the shore. The people watched in silence, knowing that this was only the beginning. Beyond the fjord, beyond the frozen pines, the hollow tree waited, and the chains that dragged him now would soon bind him in a darkness from which no Viking man ever returned. The assembly gathered in the biting wind, cloaks snapping like sails in a storm. Smoke from nearby hearths drifted across the field, but it carried no warmth here, only the weight of judgment. The prisoner was dragged to the centre, his chains rattling as he stumbled into the ring of stone. The people closed in, their faces pale beneath the winter sky. They had come not to cheer, but to witness, for this was not merely punishment, it was memory being carved into flesh and song. A Viking torture of indescribable horror awaited him, yet before it began, his deeds had to be spoken aloud. The elders stood together, men bent with age but strong with the power of words. Their voices were the law, their judgment as sharp as steel. One raised his staff, carved with runes older than any living man. His eyes swept the crowd before fixing upon the outlaw. "Hear us, kin of the fjord. This man feasted at our tables, shared Viking food at our hearths, and swore oaths upon the iron of our forefathers. Yet he spat upon them all. He betrayed the hand that raised him and shed the blood of his own." A murmur spread through the onlookers, low and bitter. Mothers held Viking children closer, as if the very sound of betrayal could taint their innocence. Warriors shifted uneasily, remembering their own oaths sworn before the gods. The elder's voice did not falter. He gave his word to the chieftain, bound in fire and steel, yet turned against him in secret. He brought the enemy to our doors, seeking silver over kin, gold over honour. The words struck harder than a war axe. To raise a weapon against a brother was one thing. To betray one's chieftain was a wound to the soul of the clan. Another elder stepped forward, his beard white as snow, his voice cracked yet strong. I saw him take the hand of his chieftain, swearing fealty before all. I saw him turn that same hand to treachery, guiding foes to the hidden paths of our village. He broke the shield wall of trust, not with sword, but with lies. His words carried the weight of years, of battles endured and lost. To break faith was to shatter the bond that kept a Viking village alive. The condemned man sagged against his chains, eyes red, lips trembling. Some said he wept from cold, others from shame, but none pitied him. A Viking man who betrayed his kin could not expect pity, only scorn. The chieftain himself stepped forward then, his cloak of wolf pelts heavy upon his shoulders, his face as hard as stone. His voice was like the crack of thunder. You were my man. I gave you place among warriors, silver from raids, land for your seed, and you gave me treachery. For that, your name will rot in the mouths of men, and your blood will be spilled for the gods to see. The skald lifted his staff, preparing to bind the tale in song. His chant rose, naming the crimes so no ear could ever forget. The outlaw's face twisted, rage flashing through shame. He spat upon the ground, his voice hoarse. I did what I must. Better silver in hand than hunger in belly. His words only deepened the crowd's disgust. Viking food earned by betrayal was poison, unfit for any man of honour. The elders raised their staves together, the sound like dry wood cracking in frost. So be it, they intoned. By blood you have wronged us. By blood you will pay. The people fell silent, the only sound the cry of a raven circling above. The prisoner sagged in his chains, knowing there would be no escape. The judgment of blood had been spoken, and soon the hollow tree would claim him, body and soul. The path to the place of torment wound through pine and frost, narrow and silent, but for the crunch of boots and the drag of chains. Ravens watched from the branches, their black eyes glinting, as if they knew the fate that waited. At the end of that path, where the trees opened to a clearing of stone and shadow, the ground itself bore the weight of judgment. Here, the earth was marked by hands long dead, scarred with sacred signs no Viking child dared touch. The carved stones stood tall, older than memory, inscribed with runes that bound the land to the gods and marked it forever as cursed ground. The prisoner was dragged forward, his chains rattling, his breath steaming in the chill. He stumbled, staring at the stones, and for a moment even his defiance faltered. These were no common markers. Each stone rose like a fang from the soil, its face etched with runes cut deep by iron chisels. The lines curled and slashed, symbols of blood, oath, and doom. They told of men who had stood where he now stood, of Viking warriors broken for their treachery, of chieftains who had called upon the gods to witness their wrath. The elders gathered near the stones, their furs brushing against the frost-bitten ground. One laid a hand upon the rough carving, his lips moving in a chant too old for most to understand. The sound rolled like thunder through the still air, and the crowd lowered their heads. These runes were not just words, they were bindings, carved with blood as much as with iron. They declared that this place was no longer earth alone, but a threshold, a doorway where mortal flesh could be handed to divine judgment. Mothers clutched their Viking children tighter as they neared the stones, whispering prayers under their breath. It was said that if a child touched the runes, they would sicken, struck by the curses woven into the rock. Even Viking men, hardened by war, stepped carefully, keeping their distance, for the air here was heavy, thick with dread. The stones seemed to hum beneath the skin, as though alive with the memories of all who had screamed within their circle. The skald's voice rose, weaving the story of the stones into his chant. He sang of the first oathbreaker cast into the hollow tree, of how his cries had echoed through the fjord for 7 nights before the ravens took him. He sang of the runes carved to hold that terror in place, to mark the ground so no one would mistake it for common soil. His song was a warning, a chain across the generations, binding Viking food, Viking fire, and Viking blood to the law of the thing. The condemned man dropped to his knees, dragged down by his chains, his eyes, bloodshot and wide, fixed upon the curling lines carved into the stone nearest him. He muttered words beneath his breath, curses or prayers none could tell, but his voice trembled as though the runes themselves had pressed into his soul. The chieftain stepped forward, his arm lifting high, and with his voice like iron he declared, "Here stands the Oathbreaker. By these stones carved in blood, let the gods see him. Let no man speak his name in honour again." The crowd murmured, some crossing themselves with pagan signs, some spitting on the ground to ward away ill fortune. The prisoner sagged forward, the cold biting into his flesh, but still he could not look away from the carvings. The stones seemed to loom higher, shadows twisting across their faces, and for the first time his chains were not the heaviest weight upon him. The judgment had already begun. The carved stones had taken his fate into their keeping, and soon the cursed ground would drink his blood as it had so many before him. The cold was sharp enough to flay the skin, yet sweat beaded on the brows of those who stood close to the stones. The prisoner had been dragged into the circle, his chains rattling against the frost-hardened earth, and now the tools of his doom were brought forth. A hammer and a coil of rope, simple things in the hands of farmers and Viking shipwrights, but here they bore a darker weight. In this place of cursed ground, they were not mere tools, but instruments of the gods' justice. The hammer was broad-headed, its haft carved with runes, the same kind used in ritual sacrifice. The rope, thick and stiff with age, had been stained by the struggles of many before. Its fibres were darkened, some said with the sweat and blood of oathbreakers who had twisted against it in vain. Both were laid upon a flat stone before the assembly, and a hush fell so heavy that even the ravens grew silent. From among the people stepped the priest, robed in furs, his face painted with ash. His staff was capped with a wolf's skull, and when he struck it once upon the ground, the air seemed to tremble. He looked upon the prisoner, then upon the crowd, and his voice was low, but it carried with a weight that seemed older than men. The gods hear, the gods see. The rope binds more than flesh, it binds the soul. The hammer drives more than iron, it drives the will of Odin into bone. He muttered words in the old tongue, words that rolled like storm winds across the fjord. No Viking child understood their meaning, yet the sound of them froze their hearts, and they clung tighter to their mothers' cloaks. Even Viking men, seasoned with axe and shield, shifted uneasily. The priest's chant was not one of mercy or hope. It was a summons, a call to the gods to look upon what was about to be done. The prisoner strained against his chains, breath ragged, eyes wild. "No god claims me," he spat, voice raw with fear. The priest turned his gaze upon him, calm as winter stone. "All men are claimed, by oath, by blood, or by the void. You will find which before the night falls." The guards seized him, dragging him toward the stone. His body thrashed, but the rope was wound swiftly, circling his wrists, his ankles, knotting tight until the blood darkened his hands. The hammer fell against the bindings, driving wooden pegs through loops of rope, fastening him to the ground as if nailing him into the earth itself. The sound of each strike echoed like thunder, and with every blow the crowd shivered. The priest bent low, whispering into the outlaw's ear, though the words were meant for all to hear. "You broke oath with man, you broke oath with kin. Now your flesh will answer, and your cries will be carried on the wind to Asgard itself." His breath clouded in the frozen air, hanging over the prisoner like smoke from a pyre. The skald began a low chant, weaving the scene into verse, his voice shaking as though the words themselves carried frost. He spoke of the hammer and the rope, of the priest's incantation, of the condemned Viking man, bound beneath the eyes of gods and men. Each syllable bound the moment into memory, so no tongue could forget it. When the hammer struck its final blow and the ropes were set, the prisoner sagged forward, bound so tightly that his chest heaved shallowly, every breath a struggle. The crowd stood silent, the only sound the whisper of the priest, still muttering prayers, words that chilled the marrow of every listener. The tools of binding were now set, and the path to torment had been opened. The gods had been called, and there would be no turning back. The clearing stank of resin and old smoke, for at its centre loomed the tree that no man dared name lightly. Once it had been a towering pine, older than the memories of any living soul, its crown rising proud above the fjord. Now it stood hollowed and blackened, its trunk split wide, and its heart carved out with axe and fire. The people said it had been struck by lightning in the days of their grandfathers, left scarred as if Odin's own spear had ripped through it. Others whispered it had been chosen by the gods themselves, shaped into a cage for human suffering. Whatever its true beginning, all knew it as the hollowed tree, a place where no Viking child would play, and no Viking man would linger once darkness fell. The prisoner was dragged before it, his body bound tight in the ropes, the hammer's blows still ringing in his bones. His head lolled forward, but his eyes flickered open, and when he saw the gaping maw of the tree, his breath rattled like dry leaves in the wind. This was no mere trunk of wood. It was a dungeon carved from living flesh, its hollow belly waiting to swallow him whole. The guards shoved him forward, his boots sinking into the frozen earth. He stumbled and struck the trunk with his shoulder, the sound echoing hollow as a drum. The crowd pressed closer, though none stepped across the boundary of carved stones. Even in their hunger for justice, they feared the tree. Its roots were said to drink not only from the soil, but from the blood spilled at its feet. A priest raised his staff, striking it once upon the earth. "Here stands the vessel," he intoned, his voice deep and cold. "Here breath and blood are swallowed. Here the gods weigh the soul." His words rolled through the still air, binding the crowd in silence. Mothers tightened their hold on Viking children, whispering charms to keep away spirits that lingered in the wood. The skald's chant rose, low and mournful, naming those who had been taken by the hollowed tree before. He sang of men who had betrayed their kin, of thralls who had risen against masters, of warriors who had abandoned the shield wall. Each name was a curse, each fate a warning. His song wound through the air like smoke, clinging to the ears of all who listened. The prisoner tried to spit, but his mouth was too dry. His voice rasped, thick with terror. "Kill me with steel, let me fall in battle. Do not cast me into that maw." But his pleas met no mercy. The chieftain's face was stone, his words final. "Steel is for men of honour. You broke oath and kin. You are nothing. The tree will claim you." At the priest's command, the guards heaved him upright and forced him against the gaping hollow. The opening yawned dark, wide enough for his body, but not his spirit. The smell of resin still clung to it, sharp and bitter, mixed with the older stench of rot. Scraps of cloth, bones gnawed by rats, and dried streaks of blood clung to the edges, grim relics of those who had come before. The ropes creaked as he was thrust inside, his shoulders scraping against the splintered walls. He thrashed, but the hollow closed around him, pressing tight, swallowing the sound of his breath. The priest raised his staff again, muttering words too ancient for most to grasp, and the people crossed themselves in the old way, warding off the evil that seeped from the tree. The hollowed tree groaned as if alive, its trunk straining against the weight of the bound man within. The crowd shivered, for they believed the wood remembered each soul it devoured. And as the trap of bark and root closed around him, the prisoner's muffled cries carried out across the clearing, a reminder to all that the gods had little mercy for oath-breakers, and that the tree's hunger was endless. The fire had been stoked since dawn, its smoke curling into the grey sky above the fjord. Men had piled the wood high, feeding it with pine and birch until the flames roared and the stones beneath cracked from the heat. At the heart of the blaze sat the cauldron, black and vast, its iron belly glowing faintly red where the flames licked its sides. Once it had served to boil Viking food for feasts, stews thick with meat and herbs. Now it was a vessel of cruelty, twisted from its place at the hearth to become an instrument of torment. The crowd gathered in a wide circle around the fire, their faces lit with the flickering glow. Mothers pressed Viking children close, shielding them from the sight, yet not daring to turn away, for this was a lesson that would shape their souls. The crackle of the flames was loud, but louder still was the hiss when damp air struck the cauldron's surface. It was a sound like a serpent coiling to strike, sharp and hateful, a warning that the gods themselves watched. The prisoner lay bound, his back against the hollowed tree, his chains rattling each time he shifted, his eyes fixed upon the cauldron, and in its red reflection his fear was plain. Sweat beaded on his brow, though the air was frozen, his breath rising in clouds as his chest heaved. He had faced steel before, had stood in the shield wall as arrows darkened the sky, but this slow heat, this waiting was more than any Viking man could bear with pride. The priest of Odin stepped forward, his ash-streaked face pale in the firelight. He lifted his staff and spoke words in the old tongue, each syllable heavy as stone. Iron serves at table, iron serves in war. Tonight, iron serves the gods. His chant wove through the crackle of the flames, chilling the crowd even as the heat pressed against their skin. The guards bent low, their hands black with soot as they set long tongs upon the cauldron's rim. The metal shuddered, glowing brighter as the fire roared beneath. The skald raised his voice, a low dirge that rolled over the assembly like a tide. He sang of past outlaws who had known the bite of heated iron, of how their screams had risen to the mountains, carried on the wind to the ears of Odin. His song was not mercy but memory, binding each cruelty into the fabric of law. The crowd listened, silent, as if their breath itself might fuel the flames. The cauldron's glow deepened, shifting from dull red to a fierce, angry orange. Sparks leapt around it, hissing as they died in the frost. The sound of the iron was no longer only a hiss, it was a groan, as if the cauldron itself despised what it had become, yet could not refuse its duty. The guards tested it with a wet cloth, and the cloth burst into steam at the touch. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, and several crossed themselves with old charms, warding away the evil they felt pressing in. The prisoner strained at his bonds, his voice hoarse. "Strike me with a sword, let me fall like a warrior." But his pleas found no ear. The chieftain's gaze was cold, his words final. "A warrior dies with honour. You are no warrior. You are oath-breaker, and the gods will drink your suffering." The cauldron glowed brighter still, the firelight painting every face with dread. The hiss filled the air, like serpents slithering unseen through the crowd. Viking children buried their faces in their mothers' cloaks, while the warriors stared hard, unwilling to look away. The priest lifted his staff once more, muttering words too ancient to understand, and pointed to the cauldron. The moment had come. The iron cauldron, once the servant of hearth and feast, now stood as a glowing beast of punishment, ready to sear the flesh of the oath-breaker and bind his screams into the memory of every man, woman, and child who dared watch. The fire had burned low, yet its glow still painted the clearing in restless light. Smoke curled upward in thin ribbons, and the scent of heated iron clung heavy to the air. But now another smell drifted into the circle, sweeter, richer, out of place amid frost and fear. From a wooden bowl the guards drew thick honey, golden and glistening, taken from the combs stored for winter. In any other season it would have been a treasure, spread upon bread or stirred into mead, a joy for Viking children at the hearth. Tonight it was poison in another form, a lure for creatures hungrier than men. The prisoner stiffened, as the bowl was lifted high. His chains rattled, the rope strained, and his voice cracked. "Number, not this." The crowd shifted, some averting their eyes, others pressing closer as though unable to look away. Everyone knew the tales. The bait of honey was no simple torment. It was a death that came slowly, devoured in bites too small to see, until they grew into agony without end. The first smear was drawn across his chest, the thick sweetness gleaming in the firelight. The guards worked with care, spreading it over his shoulders, down his arms, across his legs. His skin glistened, a grotesque mockery of feast day plenty. Where once honey had blessed Viking food, here it consecrated the body of an oath-breaker, turning him into bait for vermin and the crawling swarms of the earth. The crowd murmured, the mothers clutching their children tighter. A Viking child whimpered, buried in his mother's skirts, but she did not dare leave. To turn away from judgment was to deny the gods their witness. The priest of Odin muttered in the old tongue, his voice low and grim. "Let the small teeth do what steel does not. Let the crawling swarm take what honour you squandered." His staff thudded once against the earth, and the sound carried like a drumbeat into the silence. The outlaw writhed, the ropes biting deeper as he twisted. "Strike me down, let me bleed quick upon the ground." His pleas fell into the cold night like stones into deep water, heard but unanswered. The chieftain's face remained carved in iron, his voice heavy. "You fed betrayal to your kin. Now the earth will feed on you." The honey's scent grew stronger, sweet enough to sting the nose, cloying in the frost. Already the first vermin crept from the shadows, black ants threading through the soil, beetles stirring from bark, drawn by the promise of sugar. They climbed onto his feet, their legs scratching against raw flesh, and he shuddered violently, gagging against the ropes. The skald's chant rose, weaving the horror into verse, his words as steady as the tide. He named the man's crimes, then named the sweetness smeared upon him, telling how it would draw flies in waves, how the swarm would bite and burrow, how his body would become its own grave. His voice did not waver, though his eyes flickered with dread. This was a memory too sharp to forget, and so it would be bound into song. The prisoner's cries grew hoarse as more insects gathered, crawling over his chest and throat, their small bodies glinting in the firelight. The crowd shifted back, some gagging at the sight, others staring with cold fascination. Viking men clenched their jaws, imagining the feel of those countless legs, while Viking children whimpered softly, their mothers hushing them with trembling hands. The honey dripped slowly, thick and golden, catching on the edges of his wounds. Each drop was a promise of more torment, of endless waves of vermin and stinging flies. His body gleamed in the night, not as a warrior crowned with glory, but as a feast for crawling things. And as the first swarm descended upon him in full, the crowd realized with a shudder that the gods had devised a torment crueler than steel, a death that would not come swiftly, but gnaw him away piece by piece, until nothing remained but bones and whispers. The night pressed heavy upon the clearing, the air so still it seemed even the trees held their breath. The honey still clung to the outlaw's body, glistening under the fire's glow, already alive with crawling vermin. His muffled cries, hoarse from fear, carried across the gathering, yet the crowd did not stir. They waited, for all knew the torment had not yet reached its true depth. The guards stepped forward again, their hands gloved in rough hide, and from their belts they drew knives. These were no war blades, no broad axes, meant to cut a Viking man down in the shield wall. They were thin and sharp, honed not for death, but for suffering. The steel caught the firelight, gleaming cold, and a murmur passed through the people. The flayed skin was a cruelty rarely spoken of, a punishment remembered in whispers by the hearth, but tonight it was to be seen in full. The prisoner thrashed against his bonds, his body shining with honey and sweat, insects already burrowing at his wounds. His voice cracked, "End me with steel." Give me the axe and let me fall like a warrior." The chieftain's gaze was hard as stone. "Warriors earn steel. You chose deceit. You will earn what the gods have given you." The first knife pressed against his shoulder, just beneath the collarbone. It did not plunge deep, but bit shallow, lifting skin as one might peel bark from a tree. The man screamed, the sound tearing through the clearing, high and ragged. The knife moved slow, deliberate, carving lines down his arm. Flesh lifted and curled, and blood welled, not in great rivers but in thin streams, enough to sting, enough to make the honey run red. The insects swarmed faster, drawn by the fresh wounds, burrowing greedily into the open flesh. The skald began to chant, his voice low, sorrowful yet unyielding. He spoke of how oaths had been flayed from the outlaw's soul, just as his skin was now flayed from bone. He named the crime, the kin betrayed, the chieftain dishonoured, weaving the memory into verse so it would echo across fjords long after the body was dust. Viking children clung to their mothers, their eyes wide with horror, yet none were led away. They too must see what became of oath-breakers. The guards worked with steady hands, their knives carving shallow lines across the chest and thighs. The air filled with the iron scent of blood, sharp against the sweetness of honey. The outlaw bucked and writhed, chains rattling, his cries growing hoarse. His body shook as vermin burrowed into the flayed patches, feeding on the living flesh. The torment was not meant to kill quickly. It was meant to prolong, to leave him alive while his body became a feast. The priest of Odin raised his staff and muttered in the old tongue, his words falling like frost upon the crowd. "The flesh betrays the man as the man betrayed his kin. Let him be devoured by the earth, as his honour was devoured by greed." His voice carried into the silence, chilling every heart. Even Viking men hardened by war could not hold back a shiver. The prisoner sagged forward, his breath rasping, blood mixing with honey on his skin. Flies gathered in thick swarms, beetles crawled deeper into the wounds, and his screams weakened into ragged moans. His face twisted, eyes wide, not from the knives alone, but from the horror of feeling life itself being eaten away piece by piece. The knives had done their work. The flayed skin now bore him open to the crawling torment, every shallow cut a doorway for vermin to feast. The crowd watched in silence, knowing the gods had turned him into what he had become, a hollow shell, a man undone not by sword or spear, but by his own broken oaths. His flesh left as carrion before death had even claimed him. The night deepened, and the fire cast long, trembling shadows across the cursed ground. The outlaw sagged in his bonds, his skin glistening with blood and honey, torn open by knives that had left him raw for crawling mouths. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one sounding more beast than man. Yet still he lived, and that was the cruelest part, for life meant there was more for the earth to take. At first came the flies, thick and black, rising from the damp earth and the carcasses that lay hidden in the roots of the hollowed tree. They swirled above him in a droning cloud, then settled upon his wounds. They crawled in clusters, their bodies glinting in the firelight, their buzzing a song of hunger. The prisoner tried to twist away, thrashing against the ropes, but his struggles only smeared the honey deeper into his flayed skin. The flies swarmed over his eyes, his lips, into his nose and ears. His scream was muffled, choking, as though the insects themselves sought to steal his breath. The guards stood back, their faces cold, but even they shifted uneasily at the sight. The people pressed closer, yet kept a distance, for the swarm carried more than horror, it carried the stench of rot. Mothers clutched Viking children, whispering charms against evil, though the little ones could not tear their wide eyes from the writhing figure. To see a Viking man broken was a lesson no child would forget, burned into memory sharper than any tale. Soon the flies were joined by beetles, their hard shells clicking as they crawled from the crevices of the stones. They clambered up his legs, vanishing into the open cuts carved by the knives. Some burrowed beneath loose skin, and the man's body convulsed as though possessed. His cries rose again, high and cracked, yet already weaker than before. Blood ran down his thighs, dark and sluggish, mingling with the honey until his body gleamed wet and foul. Then came the worms, pale and writhing, drawn from the damp earth where decay had seeped for generations. They squirmed up through the mud, their bodies twisting as they sought the warmth of living flesh. One by one they reached him, slithering into wounds and under folds of flayed skin. The crowd groaned in low horror as they disappeared into him, vanishing from sight as though swallowed by the man himself. The outlaw's eyes bulged, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the crawling things filled him from within. The skald lifted his voice, his chant a dirge that cut through the buzzing. He sang of the swarm as a punishment deeper than steel, how flies and beetles and worms became the warriors of the gods, feasting upon the Oathbreaker as carrion before death had claimed him. His voice wove grief and dread, binding the sight into verse so it could never be forgotten. The sound of it was heavy, pressing on the hearts of all who stood there. The priest raised his staff, his words slow and terrible. He fed betrayal to his kin. Now the swarm feeds upon him. This is the will of the gods. His ash-streaked face glowed in the firelight, his eyes as cold as ice. No plea for mercy rose from him, only the certainty that justice was being done. The outlaw sagged, his body twitching as insects filled every wound, every crevice. His moans had grown low, half groan, half rattle, as though his voice itself was being eaten away. Flies crawled across his tongue when he tried to cry out. Beetles vanished beneath his ribs. Worms slid into his torn flesh. The crowd stared, transfixed, bound in horror and awe. Here was a death no sword could grant, no axe could finish. Here was a torment that stripped a man of flesh and honour alike, leaving him nothing but meat for the smallest of creatures. And as the swarm feasted, the people knew the gods had turned their faces toward this place, watching with the same cold hunger that now consumed the traitor's body. The sky stretched wide and endless, heavy with stars that glittered like cold eyes watching from the heavens. Frost crept over the clearing, glazing the stones and stiffening the ropes that bound the outlaw to the hollowed tree. The fire had sunk to embers, its glow little more than a dying heart, yet still the cries carried. Low, guttural moans rose from the prisoner's throat, rasping through swollen lips, echoing into the night air like the wailing of spirits. The sound drifted down to the village by the fjord, carried on the wind that whispered through the pine. Men lying in their longhouses stirred uneasily, turning in their furs. Mothers drew Viking children close, pressing hands over small ears, though the little ones had already heard. The cries pierced walls, seeped into dreams, and settled in the marrow. It was not the voice of a warrior facing death, but the sound of something unravelling, of a soul torn loose yet unable to escape. No one dared rise to silence him. To draw close to the cursed ground after dark was to invite the wrath of gods and spirits alike. The runes carved into the stones were said to glow faintly in moonlight, pulsing with the memory of those who had moaned before. The people muttered that even the hollowed tree was awake, groaning along with its captive, drinking in his pain. Better to endure the sound than to walk into that place when the stars alone bore witness. The guards, chosen by lot, sat with spears in hand at the edge of the clearing. Their faces were pale, their eyes fixed on the fire's embers, yet even they flinched when the moans grew sharp, tearing through the night like a wolf's howl. One spat into the frost, muttering that he would rather face steel in battle than keep watch over this. Another crossed himself with the old sign, warding away spirits, for the cries no longer sounded wholly human. The skald, though wrapped in a thick cloak, did not sleep. He sat apart, lips moving in a hushed chant, as if to cage the sounds in verse. His voice trembled, for how could song bind such terror? Yet he knew it must be remembered. The moans beneath the stars were part of the punishment, a warning as powerful as the sight of flayed skin or the swarm of vermin. Generations would one day sing of it, though the memory would bring no pride. Within the longhouse of the chieftain, the people of rank lay restless. Even there, with walls of timber and a fire on the hearth, the outlaw's voice reached them. The chieftain stared into the flames, his jaw clenched. His wife spoke no word, only turned her face away, for though she did not question the judgment, the cries gnawed at her heart. A Viking man might die by axe or spear, but this endless moaning felt like listening to a ghost before its time. Children whimpered, asking why the gods did not silence him. Their mothers answered in low tones that the gods wished them to hear, that every moan was a reminder. A Viking child who lay awake that night would remember for all his days the sound of what became of oathbreakers. It was not merely punishment, it was teaching. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, cold and pitiless, as the cries rose and fell. Sometimes they came as a low groan, barely heard above the wind. At other times they split the night, shrill and ragged, echoing from the cliffs and rolling across the fjord until it seemed the very waters moaned. Dogs howled in the village, unsettled by the sound, and even the cattle shifted nervously in their pens. And so the night stretched on, filled with a music no man wished to hear. The moans beneath the stars lingered, each one a wound upon the silence, each one a reminder that the gods were watching, that treachery would never find rest. By dawn, when the cries dwindled to little more than a rasp, no man, woman, or child had slept soundly. The outlaw's torment had become their own, and the memory of that night would follow them like a shadow long after the stars faded from the sky. The clearing was hushed, but for the crackle of the embers and the ragged groans that bled from the prisoner's throat. His body was swollen, streaked with blood and honey, alive with vermin. The people looked on in grim silence, but at the edge of the cursed stones, one man stepped forward, clutching a staff carved with runes. He was no warrior, no priest, but his burden was heavier than both. He was the skald, the keeper of memory, and this night he would bear witness. His cloak hung loose around narrow shoulders, and his lips trembled as he spoke. He was no stranger to battlefields, having sung of Viking men who fell with axes in their hands, of chieftains crowned in blood and smoke. Yet this was no battlefield. Here there was no clash of shields, no glory in death. Here there was only the drawn-out unravelling of a man, and the skald's voice quivered as he bound it in words. He lifted his staff and began to chant, low at first, then rising. His voice carried the weight of the moment into verse, each line etched into the cold night as surely as a knife into wood. He spoke of the oath broken, the kin betrayed, the chieftain dishonoured. He sang of chains dragging across the fjord shore, of the hollowed tree swallowing flesh, of honey smeared like poison upon the skin. His voice faltered as he described the flaying knives, yet he pressed on, for a skald could not turn from truth, however cruel. The crowd shifted, listening with bowed heads. Mothers who shielded Viking children's eyes still let their ears take in the song, for the story must live longer than the cries. Warriors clenched their jaws, hands tightening on spear shafts, as though the verses themselves were carving runes into their hearts. Even the chieftain stood still, his stern face shadowed in the fire's glow, giving no sign of doubt or pity. The prisoner writhed, his chains rattling as the skald's words wrapped around him. Perhaps he understood, perhaps not. But the song gave his torment form, shaping it into something that would outlive him. No man could undo betrayal, but by the skald's voice, none could forget it. The skald's staff struck the frozen ground in rhythm with his verse. His voice shook, yet he forced it stronger, casting his fear into the words themselves. He told of the swarm, the flies that feasted upon wounds, the worms burrowing into flesh, the beetles crawling beneath the skin. He sang of the moans beneath the stars, how the village heard them and turned in their beds, unable to flee the sound. He sang of the priest's cold prayers, of the chieftain's judgment of blood, of the carved stones that glowed with curses. A Viking child whimpered, burying his face in his mother's cloak, but the skald's chant did not falter, for memory was not meant to comfort. it was meant to sear. If the people turned their eyes from horror, the song would keep it alive, sharper than sight. That was the skald's burden, heavier than steel, for it chained him not to flesh but to words. When his voice finally broke, he lowered his head, staff trembling in his grasp. The air seemed thicker, pressed down by the weight of what he had spoken. The outlaw moaned again, and the sound mingled with the last of the skald's chant, echoing into the star-crowded sky. The priest of Odin nodded once, grave and satisfied. The gods have heard, the people have heard. Now it will never be forgotten. The skald bowed, his throat raw, knowing he had bound the night into eternity. The clearing was silent, but for the prisoner's ragged breath, the scuttling of insects, and the whisper of fire. The skald turned away at last, his voice gone but his duty fulfilled. He had sung what none wished to hear, and by that song the horror was sealed forever in the memory of the Viking people. The firelight danced upon her face, casting shadows that deepened the hollows of her eyes. She stood among the crowd, silent as the ropes tightened, silent as the knives had carved, silent even now as vermin crawled across the flesh of her kin. She was the sister's daughter of the condemned, and though the people muttered that blood bound her to his shame, she did not move from her place at the edge of the cursed stones. She watched, torn between the horror that clenched her heart and the fire of vengeance that burned behind her gaze. The moans of the prisoner carried to her ears like echoes of childhood. Once he had lifted her upon his shoulders when she was a Viking child, running across the meadow while she shrieked with laughter. Once he had shared Viking food with her at the hearth, offering her the choicest cut of meat when her mother's hand had gone empty. Yet here he hung, stripped of skin, crawling with insects, a broken man who had betrayed oath and kin. Memory clashed with truth until her chest ached. The villagers gave her space, none daring to stand too close. Some whispered that she should not have come, that a kinswoman had no place in such a gathering. Others said she must see, for it was her blood that had been dishonoured. She heard them all and cared for none. Her eyes never left him, not even when his screams cracked the night. She wanted to look away, yet the gods seemed to root her feet to the ground. Her hands trembled at her sides, nails biting her palms until blood welled. Horror twisted within her, for the sight was more than any soul should bear. But beneath the horror stirred something darker, something hotter, a hunger to avenge. Not to avenge him, for his guilt was plain, his treachery beyond denial, but to avenge the shame his betrayal had dragged upon their bloodline. She could not raise her voice against the chieftain's judgment, but in her heart she swore that his cries would not be the last. If ever fate gave her the chance, she would see those who had tempted him to treachery suffer tenfold. The priest's chant rose, muttering to the gods, and the swarm thickened upon him. He sagged, his eyes rolling, but still his lips moved, whispering words she could not hear. Perhaps curses, perhaps pleas. She bit her lip until it bled, for she longed to scream at him to ask why. Why he had turned against his own, why he had cast shame upon their name, why he had forced her to stand here with the weight of his ruin crushing her chest. The skald's voice rose again, naming his crimes, binding them into song. Each word struck her like a hammer. She clenched her fists tighter, and for a moment she wished the song would falter, that memory would wither. But memory was the skald's burden, and so the verses wound around the clearing like chains. His name would be cursed forever, and so too the blood that tied him to her. When her eyes met the chieftain's, she did not flinch. He looked at her as though measuring her silence, as though daring her to speak. She said nothing, but her gaze held steady. Let him see her grief. Let him see her rage. She was no shield maiden, no warrior, yet she carried the storm within her breast. The night stretched long, the prisoner's cries fading to a hoarse rattle. Still she did not move. She watched until his head sagged, and his breath grew shallow, until the vermin feasted more boldly, until the fire sank to coals. Only then did she bow her head, not in prayer, but in oath. Her kin had brought shame, she would carry vengeance. And though she trembled in horror, though tears cut lines down her cheeks, she whispered into the cold air, blood for blood. The gods, she thought, would hear. The dawn broke grey over the fjord, the sun weak behind a shroud of mist. Frost clung to the grass, and the ravens were already circling, their black wings whispering across the sky. At the edge of the cursed stones, the people gathered once more, drawn by the same grim pull that had kept them awake through the night. What they saw as the light revealed the clearing turned many faces pale. The outlaw still lived. His chest rose in shallow, ragged breaths, though his body had become scarcely human. The ropes bit deeper into his swollen limbs, cutting flesh that bulged around them. His skin, once pale, now gleamed with bruises of black and purple, stretched tight where the insects had burrowed and the wounds had festered. Honey and blood mingled into a foul sheen, glistening in the cold morning light. The swarm had not left him. Flies still clung to every surface, beetles crawled in and out of the flayed cuts, and worms twisted just beneath the skin, shifting as though his body itself writhed in revolt. A murmur rose through the crowd, not of pity, but of awe. A Viking man might endure an axe blow, a spear thrust, or the fire of a burning hall, but this survival past, the first night, was proof of a punishment beyond mortal cruelty. Some whispered that the gods kept him alive, holding him at the threshold of death to make his torment last. Others said it was the hollowed tree itself, feeding on his spirit, refusing to release him. Mothers shielded Viking children's eyes, yet the little ones still peeked, their faces pale and lips trembling. This sight, more than any tale or song, would etch itself into their hearts. They would remember the swollen figure, moaning in agony, as long as they drew breath. Warriors shifted uneasily, hands clenched on spear shafts, for they knew that no steel, no battle, no wound of war could compare to such slow ruin. The outlaw's head lifted weakly, his eyes bloodshot and glazed, his lips cracked open, and a sound crawled out, neither word nor scream, but a gurgling moan that carried into the mist. His breath rattled, thick with rot, yet still he clung to life. The crowd flinched as the stench reached them, a reek of decay mixed with honey's sickly sweetness. It was the smell of a body rotting, while the soul still lingered inside. The priest of Odin raised his staff, his voice grave. Behold, the gods hold him fast. He is not yet taken, for his blood has not balanced the scales. Let all see what oath-breaking brings, and let none forget. His words carried over the hush, searing themselves into the minds of all who listened. The skald's voice followed, shaking as he sang. He bound the second day into verse, telling of flesh swollen like a drowned beast, of insects feasting as if at a grim banquet, of life stubbornly refusing to depart. His chant wove the horror into memory, his staff striking the ground with each line. Even as he trembled, he did not falter, for his burden was to remember. The outlaw shuddered, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. His body convulsed as though fighting the creatures inside him, yet still he did not die. His chains rattled weakly, his swollen hands twitching, and again the moan rose, a sound so pitiful that even the ravens paused in their circling. The people watched, silent, bound by dread. No Viking food could sweeten this day, no feast could wash the stench of it from their tongues. This was no quick justice, no end at the edge of a sword. This was a cruelty stretched beyond imagination, a torment meant to break not only the body, but the spirit of all who saw it. And as the second day waned, with the outlaw still alive in his swollen ruin, the crowd knew they looked upon more than punishment. They looked upon proof that the gods themselves had no mercy for those who betrayed kin and chieftain, and that death, when it came, would be a kindness denied. The cries had softened to a low, rusping groan, but the horror of the clearing only deepened. The outlaw hung swollen and trembling, his body alive with crawling vermin, his wounds raw and festering. Flies swarmed in clouds above him, a black halo against the pale sky, while worms writhed beneath his torn flesh. The stench of decay spread outward like smoke, seeping into every breath. Men and women endured it in silence, their faces carved into masks of stone. But the children, those Viking children brought to witness the law of the Thing, could not hide their fear. They clutched at their mothers' skirts, burying small faces in wool and fur, yet their eyes always returned to the figure bound to the hollowed tree. Wide and unblinking, their gaze clung to him, drawn by the horror no tale by the hearth could ever conjure. A Viking child knew of raids and fire, of axes splitting shields, and men falling in battle, but this was something different. This was no warrior's death, no swift stroke of steel. This was slow unravelling, and it clawed into their hearts. Mothers whispered charms into the ears of their little ones, murmuring the names of gods for protection. They stroked trembling hair, pressing hands over small eyes when the prisoner moaned or thrashed. Yet the children squirmed, peeking between fingers, compelled by a terror that would not release them. To look away felt impossible, as though the gods themselves demanded their witness. Each twitch of the outlaw's body, each insect crawling into wounds, carved itself into their memory deeper than any lesson spoken aloud. The boys clutched carved wooden toys in their hands, forgotten now, their knuckles white around them. The girls pressed against their mothers, their breaths coming sharp and quick. One child whimpered, asking why the man did not die, why the gods let him linger. The mother hushed him, but her own voice trembled, for she too wondered. Another child asked if the swarm would come for him in his sleep. His father gripped his shoulder hard, saying only, "Remember, this is the fate of oath-breakers." The skald's voice wove through the silence, chanting verse that named the crimes and bound the moment in song. Yet his words, though heavy, seemed less powerful than the sight itself. For the children no chant was needed. They would carry the sound of moans and the sight of vermin feasting with them long into their days. Even when they grew into Viking men and women, wielding axe or spinning wool, they would recall this night whenever the word oath was spoken. One boy pressed close to his mother, his small body trembling. He whispered that the outlaw had once shared Viking food with him at a feast, giving him roasted meat when his hands were empty. His mother said nothing, only tightened her hold. The boy's eyes glistened with confusion, for how could a man who once fed a child now be fed upon by worms? The answer lay heavy in the air, unspoken. Betrayal turned all gifts to ash. As the outlaw moaned again, high and broken, several children whimpered in unison. Still, none fled. Their parents did not carry them away, for to leave was to deny the law its full weight. The children must see, must learn with their own eyes, that dishonour did not end with death, but with a torment that lingered beyond the reach of mercy. The night crept closer, stars kindling above the fjord. The fire was stoked again, its glow painting every face. The children huddled against their mothers, shivering, not from cold, but from fear that clung like frost to their bones. And though they longed to turn away, they did not. Their eyes returned again and again to the broken figure at the tree, to the swarm that claimed him piece by piece. It was the children's fear that sealed the punishment's power, not the chants, not the judgment of elders, not even the cries of the condemned, but the memory etched forever into young hearts that betrayal would not only end a man, but turn him into a tale of dread to haunt every generation yet to come. The air grew heavy as the second night fell, and the clearing lay wrapped in a silence, broken only by the rasping moans of the condemned. His body sagged against the ropes, swollen and torn, crawling with vermin. The honey smeared upon him had grown foul, mingling with blood and rot until the stench carried down to the village below. Men and women stood in the circle of stones, grim as ever, but their eyes turned often to the sky, for the hour was near when signs would come. It began with a shadow sweeping across the moon, A harsh cry split the silence, a croak that made the hairs rise on every neck. Then another followed, and another, until the night was filled with the beating of wings. Ravens circled above, black against the silver light, their cries sharp as iron striking stone. The people bowed their heads, for all knew whose messengers they were. Odin's birds had come, not as scavengers alone, but as witnesses, bearing the judgment of the All-Father. The outlaw stirred weakly, his eyes rolling upward. He saw the shapes descend, felt the air stir as they beat their wings closer. His lips cracked apart in a hoarse cry, though whether it was plea or curse, none could tell. The first raven landed upon his shoulder, its claws digging into raw flesh. It tilted its head, black eyes glittering, then struck its beak deep into the wound left by the knife. The man shrieked, the sound piercing, but the people did not flinch. To them, this was no cruelty of chance. It was divine approval. More birds followed, settling upon him with the heavy weight of doom. They pecked at his chest, his arms, tearing at strips of flayed skin. The insects scattered briefly, only to return when the ravens had opened new wounds. Blood welled fresh, and the smell thickened, drawing the birds into a frenzy. They croaked and tore, their wings beating as they fought for morsels of flesh. The condemned bucked against the ropes, his cries echoing into the dark, but the birds clung tighter, their beaks striking again and again. The priest raised his staff, his voice loud over the chaos. "Behold the will of Odin, the ravens feast, and so the gods are satisfied." His words rolled across the crowd, and many crossed themselves in the old way, whispering prayers of awe and fear. To see the birds descend upon an oath-breaker was proof that the gods had turned their gaze to the thing, that justice had been bound not only by men, but by the heavens. Viking children cowered behind their mothers, peeking with wide eyes as the birds fed. They trembled, but their parents did not shield them, for this too was part of the lesson. To see Odin's messengers at work was to know that no oath, once broken, escaped the sight of the gods. One boy whispered that the birds would carry scraps of flesh to Valhalla as warning, and though his mother hushed him, she shivered, for she half believed it true. The skald's chant rose above the cries, weaving the vision into verse. He sang of the ravens as the teeth of Odin, of their wings darkening the moon, of their hunger as the gods' own hunger for justice. His voice cracked, yet he pressed on, binding the horror into memory. The outlaw's name was carried on the song, forever cursed, while the image of the ravens tearing his flesh would never fade from the hearts of those who saw it. The condemned sagged lower, blood dripping from his wounds, his cries fading into broken moans. The ravens croaked and tore, their beaks slick, their eyes glittering in the firelight. And the people, though their stomachs turned, did not look away. For in that moment they believed with all their hearts that the gods had spoken through the wings and beaks of Odin's birds. The judgment was just, the punishment sanctified. Above the clearing, the sky filled with the sound of wings, and the oath, breaker's ruin, became more than a man's torment. It became a sign, etched upon the night, that the gods themselves had seen and approved. By the third day, the clearing had become a place none could approach without gagging. The prisoner still clung to life, his breath shallow, his flesh swollen and torn, but it was not his moans alone that chilled the people now, it was the stench. The air hung thick and foul, as if the earth itself had soured beneath the hollowed tree. The smell of decay, of blood mingled with honey, of flesh gnawed by vermin and ravens, drifted far beyond the circle of carved stones. Even the wind seemed tainted, carrying the rot down toward the fjord, into the nostrils of every soul in the village. Men stood at the edge of the clearing, their hands pressed to their mouths, their eyes watering. Mothers whispered prayers, holding Viking children close, yet even the little ones could not escape the foulness that clung to their throats and made their stomachs turn. Warriors, hardened by years of battle and slaughter, spat into the frost. muttering that no battlefield had ever reeked so strongly, for the stench here was not of the dead alone, but of the living rotting before their eyes. The prisoner's body sagged against the ropes, alive only in twitching spasms. His wounds, once raw, had begun to fester, crawling with maggots that writhed in pale clusters. Each movement released a fresh wave of odour, heavy and choking, turning the air into a poison none could ignore. The swarm buzzed louder, flies thick upon every inch of him, their bodies glistening with gore. Ravens perched upon the branches above, waiting for their turn, their black eyes bright with hunger. The priest of Odin raised his staff, his voice steady, though even he winced at the smell. The air itself bears witness. The gods foul the breath of all who stand here, so that none may forget the wages of betrayal. His words sank into the silence, yet none dared answer. The stench was its own sermon, stronger than chant or song. It forced itself upon the people, burrowing into their hair, their clothes, their very skin, so that even when they returned to their longhouses, the memory of it would cling like smoke. The skald lifted his voice, though it cracked as he spoke. He bound the stench into verse, describing how the hollowed tree had become unholy, how the ground drank the rot and breathed it back upon the living. His song carried sorrow and warning alike, his staff striking the earth with each line. Yet even he turned his head aside between verses, his throat tightening against the foul air. A Viking child whimpered, asking if the smell would creep into his bed, if it would follow him into dreams. His mother hushed him, though her own eyes watered, and whispered that the gods used the stench to mark cursed ground so all would know to keep away. She told him the odour would fade when the body was gone, though she did not believe it herself. The chieftain stood firm, his cloak heavy upon his shoulders, though even he held a cloth to his mouth. He did not speak, for there was no need. The stench said more than judgment could. It was proof that the gods had turned their gaze upon this place, and that the hollowed tree drank more than blood, it drank the soul itself, leaving the land tainted. The people began to whisper that the ground was no longer fit for step, that grass would never grow thick there again, that the smell was the breath of hell seeping through the soil. Some muttered of curses, of spirits that would linger long after the body had turned to bone. Yet none dared to leave before the end, for to turn away was to deny the law of the thing. The stench of death clung to the clearing, pressing upon every chest, burning every throat, making even the strongest Viking men tremble. And, as the people endured it, they knew that this ground had been marked unholy forever. No plough would break it, no feast would bless it, no laughter of Viking children would ever ring there again. It was now a place of rot, consecrated by decay, cursed by the gods, to remind all who lived that betrayal stank worse than death itself. The outlaw swayed in his bonds, his body bloated, torn, and crawling with vermin. His lips cracked as he mouthed sounds that no one could understand, words broken by fever and pain. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, no longer looked upon the people around him. They gazed far away, past the clearing, past the stones, as if they pierced the very veil that lay between Midgard and the realms beyond. On the third night, as the stars wheeled cold above, the prisoner's mind began to unravel, and visions gripped him like talons. He saw gods' first vast figures that shimmered in the darkness, their forms carved from storm and flame. Odin's one eye burned like a coal, staring into his marrow, weighing his deeds. The outlaw tried to speak, to plead, but his words drowned in his throat. He saw Thor with his hammer, each strike echoing like the blows of the iron upon his bonds. Freya's weeping face turned from him, her tears falling as spears of ice. They did not come to save him, nor to comfort. They came to remind him that oaths sworn upon their names had been broken, and that his torment was their judgment made flesh. His head sagged, and in the flicker of the firelight he saw giants rise from the forest, their shapes twisted and enormous. Their breath steamed, their laughter rolled like thunder. They reached with hands the size of trees, clawing at his swollen limbs, eager to pull him into Jotunheim, where traitors rotted forever. He screamed then, high and broken, thrashing against the ropes, though no hand touched him in truth. The people murmured, crossing themselves in the old way, for they thought the gods themselves had set visions upon him. The sea came last, whispering to him in a voice as soft as the tide, yet sharp as a spear. He smelled its salt, even over the stench of decay, and he saw waves rising beyond the fjord, tall as mountains, calling him home. He remembered longships cutting through storm spray, remembered the taste of salt on his lips as he rode beside his brothers, a Viking man full of pride and hunger for plunder. The sea promised him release, promised to carry him far from the swarm that gnawed his flesh. In his fevered mind he tried to step forward, to plunge into the waves, but the ropes dragged him back, binding him to the hollowed tree. The crowd watched in silence as he raved. He muttered to unseen figures, cursed the air, begged for mercy, laughed like a madman, then wept as a child might weep. His words stumbled from his mouth in fragments, names of gods, names of kin long dead, broken oaths whispered again, as though he could mend them by speaking. A Viking child buried his face in his mother's cloak, whispering that the man spoke to giants, but the mother hushed him, for she too feared the truth of it. The priest lifted his staff, his voice calm as winter stone. The gods have opened his eyes, they show him the path he chose, the ruin he earned. This is no madness, it is judgment. His words sank into the people like frost. To them, the prisoner's visions were proof, a final cruelty before his end. The gods would not let him die in silence. They would strip him bare, body and soul, until nothing remained but shame and terror. The outlaw's head snapped back, his mouth opening in a final cry. He shouted of waves breaking, of ravens tearing at the sun, of Odin's eye burning him to ash. Then his voice broke into a whimper, low and ragged, as though the visions had swallowed him whole. The people drew back, for the clearing now felt thick with spirits. Whether gods, giants, or the sea itself, something had come close enough to touch him. And as he sagged again in his bonds, trembling and half dead, they knew his torment had turned inward, where no knife or swarm could reach. The prisoner's visions were the cruelest punishment, yet proof that even in madness there was no escape. The third night fell heavy over the fjord. The stars dimmed behind a veil of cloud, and the clearing around the hollowed tree seemed swallowed in a darkness deeper than any before. The fire burned low, its glow little more than a smoulder, yet still the people gathered, for no one could stay away from what lingered there. The outlaw still clung to life, though he was more corpse than man. His body sagged in the ropes, swollen and purple, crawling with vermin that glistened wet in the fire's faint light. His breath faltered, rising in shallow gasps, as if each one might be the last, yet still death refused him. The moans that had filled the nights before now came softer, broken into rattles that sounded less human than beast. At times he fell silent, his chest unmoving, and the crowd whispered that hell had claimed him at last. But then, with a shudder, his ribs rose again, dragging another ragged breath from his lungs. It was as if the gods themselves held him on the threshold, unwilling to grant him mercy, unwilling to release him to the underworld. His torment lingered between life and hell's gate, and all who watched felt the chill of that balance. Mothers pressed Viking children close, whispering prayers, their voices shaking. Yet the little one still peered with wide eyes, unable to look away. A Viking child whimpered that the man looked like a ghost already, and his mother hushed him, though the truth of it chilled her as well. Warriors spat into the frost, muttering that no axe or sword had ever dealt such a cruel wound. To see a Viking man half dead, breathing still while rot consumed him, was to see the god's judgment laid bare. The priest stepped forward, his staff raised, his face painted with ash. His voice cut the silence, heavy and solemn. The third night has come. His spirit hovers at the gate, yet hell will not take him. The gods hold him fast, for his debt is not yet paid." His words rolled through the crowd, and the people bowed their heads, for they believed it true. If death delayed, then it was because the gods willed his suffering to last. The skald, his voice raw from nights of chanting, began again, though softer now, as though afraid to wake spirits that lingered too close. He sang of the man's breath faltering, of his body caught between worlds, of how Hell's Gate yawned wide but did not yet claim him. The chant was more whisper than song, yet it carried, weaving the moment into memory. Even half dead, the outlaw was bound into verse, so his shame would never fade. The prisoner's head lolled forward, his chin slick with blood and honey turned sour. His lips moved, shaping words no one could hear. Some said he begged for water, others that he cursed the gods. Once his eyes flickered open, staring at the crowd without seeing them, and in their glazed depths lay a terror beyond anything the ropes or knives could give. He was already half in Hell's realm, and what he saw there froze the marrow of all who met his gaze. The night stretched long, each moment heavier than the last. The air stank of decay, thick and suffocating, as though the ground itself was rotting beneath the tree. Ravens croaked from the branches, restless, as if waiting for permission to finish what they had begun. The fire hissed, spitting sparks into the dark, and each sound seemed sharper in the silence that wrapped the clearing. At last, the prisoner gave a long, shuddering groan, his chest sinking so low it seemed he would not rise again. The crowd held their breath, waiting until his ribs lifted once more, dragging another rattle into the night. A murmur spread, half awe, half dread. Still he lived. Still the gods denied him release. And so the third night passed, not with death, but with the slow torment of a man lingering between two worlds, bound in pain too deep for words, too cruel for mercy. His life was a candle guttering in the wind, yet the flame refused to die, and all who saw it knew they were in the presence of something beyond mortal law, caught between life and Hell's Gate, where the gods alone decided the hour of his end. The chieftain stood apart from the circle, his cloak of wolf pelts drawn close against the frost, though the cold that gnawed at him came not from the air but from within. The firelight painted his face in stark lines, and though his eyes remained fixed upon the prisoner bound to the hollowed tree, his thoughts drifted deeper than the clearing. He had spoken the judgment, had named the outlaw an oath-breaker, and by his word the torment had begun. Yet as the third night waned, and the man still clung to life, the chieftain felt the weight of power heavy upon his shoulders. The outlaw's body sagged, grotesque and swollen, crawling with vermin that fed without mercy. Ravens croaked as they tore at fresh wounds, and the stench of decay hung thick over the clearing. The people whispered that Odin himself had turned his gaze upon the thing, holding the man at the threshold of death to prolong his shame. But the chieftain's heart twisted with unease. Was this truly the will of the gods, or had his own hand driven the torment too far? He remembered the man, as he once was, a Viking warrior, standing tall in the shield wall, blood on his axe, glory in his eyes. He had eaten Viking food beside his brothers, had laughed loud in the mead hall, had sworn loyalty with fire and steel. To see him now, reduced to a feast for insects, moaning like a beast in the night, stirred not triumph, but a gnawing doubt. Had he, the chieftain, turned judgment into cruelty? The murmurs of the villagers carried to his ears. Some praised the punishment as proof of strength, saying it would bind loyalty tighter than any oath. Others muttered that the gods themselves seemed slow to claim the man, as though uncertain of the justice done. A Viking child whimpered against his mother's cloak, and the sound cut sharper than steel. What lesson did this teach? Fear, yes, but did it honour the gods, or did it shame them with a spectacle too cruel even for oathbreakers? The priest moved through the crowd, his staff striking the earth, his voice cold and certain. The gods are pleased, he declared. His torment is their justice, his cries their music. Let no man question the will of Odin. Yet the chieftain's jaw tightened, for he did question. He had led men into battle, had watched them die bravely, and had seen the light of honour in their eyes even as life fled them. That was death, as the gods intended. This endless rotting felt different. The skald's chant rose again, binding the night into verse. His voice cracked, and for the first time the chieftain wondered if even the skald faltered at the sight. To sing of warriors was one thing. To sing of a kinsman eaten alive by worms was another. Would this song inspire loyalty, or sow fear so deep it turned brother against brother? The outlaw stirred then, his swollen lips parting in a low moan. His eyes opened, clouded and red, yet for a moment they locked upon the chieftain. There was no plea in them, no mercy sought. Only a mirror, a reflection of the torment that now bled into the chieftain's own heart. He turned his gaze away, but the image lingered. He clenched his fist around the hilt of his knife, though he did not draw it. A single stroke could end it all, could grant release. Yet to do so would be to undo the judgment, to show doubt before his people. A chieftain who faltered would lose more than face, he would lose power, and power once lost was never regained. And so he stood, silent, his heart torn between mercy and duty. The people believed the gods demanded this torment, but in the stillness of his soul he wondered if it was only men who demanded it, men and himself. The chieftain's doubt burned colder than the night air, and though he gave no sign, the weight of it pressed upon him as heavy as the wolf cloak upon his shoulders. The skald's voice, carried long after the fire had burned to ash. Wrapped in his cloak, staff in hand, he stood beneath the fading stars, and let the verses fall from his lips like stones into a fjord. Each line bound the horror into memory. Each word carved the outlaw's torment deeper into the marrow of the people. He sang of the chains dragging through mud and ice, of the carved stones glowing with curses, of the honey that turned a Viking man's body into bait for vermin. He sang of the knives flaying skin, of the swarm that feasted, of the ravens that tore at flesh, while the hollowed tree drank in the cries. His voice quivered, but he did not falter, for his burden was clear. The tale must live longer than the man. By dawn, the people carried the song with them as they left the cursed ground. Mothers whispered fragments to Viking children, their voices low, turning the verses into warnings against oath-breaking. Warriors muttered stanzas under their breath as they sharpened axes, repeating the tale as if to steel their hearts against betrayal within their own ranks. Even the old ones, who had seen many winters, rocked gently in the shadows of their longhouses, murmuring the skald's words until they became part of the air itself. Soon the song spread beyond the village. Traders carried it across the fjord, letting it slip into mead halls where strangers listened with narrowed eyes. Sailors sang it over the creak of oars, their voices low and rough, as if the gods themselves leaned close to hear. In distant settlements, men who had never seen the hollowed tree repeated the tale as though they had stood there themselves. Each time it was sung, the punishment grew sharper, the swarm thicker, the cries louder. The curse of it travelled farther than any ship. The song was no mere story, it was a weapon. Its verses warned that betrayal did not end with death, but with torment that lingered beyond flesh. The outlaw's name was never spoken with honour again, but spat with contempt, tied forever to shame. The skald wove his crimes into the rhythm, and every ear that heard the song knew the weight of those words. To swear falsely, to betray kin, to break oath to a chieftain, was to invite not only death, but a fate so cruel that even hell's gate seemed merciful by comparison. The chieftain himself listened in silence when the skald sang before the hearth, his wolf cloak heavy upon his shoulders. His doubt lingered, yet he let the song stand unchallenged. For though the verses haunted him, they bound the people together in fear and unity. No Viking food shared at the hearth, no laughter in the hall, could erase the sound of the skald's chant echoing beneath the rafters. The outlaw's torment, had become a tale greater than any raid, greater even than many battles won. Ravens croaked from rooftops, as if keeping the memory alive, their wings dark against the pale winter sky. Children played by the shore and dared each other to sing the verses aloud, their voices trembling as though speaking the curse too loudly might draw the gods' attention. Old men muttered that the song would outlast the stones themselves, for memory carried in verse was stronger than any carved rune. And so it spread across fjords, through valleys, into halls where strangers gathered over ale. It was sung as warning, it was sung as curse, it was sung as a reminder that oaths were chains stronger than iron, and betrayal tore a man not only from his kin, but from the favour of the gods. The skald's song lingered in every ear, a shadow that clung to each heart. And long after the outlaw's body rotted into the roots of the hollowed tree, his suffering lived on in verse, echoing across the northlands, a story that could never be silenced. She stood at the edge of the stones, her cloak drawn tight, though the cold was the least of what gnawed at her. Her eyes were hollow from nights without sleep, her cheeks sunken where no Viking food had passed her lips since the judgment was spoken. She was the outlaw's wife, once honoured at the feasts, once seated near the chieftain's hearth. Now she was marked as kin to the condemned, and though no hand had touched her, she felt the weight of the whole clan pressing her into the earth. The prisoner hung before her, more shadow than man. His body was swollen, torn, black with rot and crawling with the swarm. His breath rasped like a dying fire, rising and sinking as though each one might be his last. She stared at him without blinking. Her grief burned so hot it had turned to iron. She had wept in the first days, had torn her hair and beaten her breast, but no tears came now. What filled her heart was not sorrow but a fury colder than the fjord itself. The people shifted uneasily when they saw her step closer. Some whispered that she should not be there, that a woman had no voice in the thing once judgment was passed. Others said the gods themselves had drawn her to this place, to speak words no man would dare utter. Even the chieftain, stern as stone, did not stop her. He only watched, his jaw set, as if to measure the strength of her spirit. She lifted her hands, thin and trembling, and raised her voice so that all could hear. You have stripped me of husband, of name, of place at the hearth. You have bound my children to shame not of their making. You say this is the will of the gods, but I see only the will of men, crueler than any god would dare be. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on, louder now, the fire of her words striking the people harder than any blow. A Viking child whimpered against his mother's cloak, but the crowd did not move. They stood frozen, caught by her voice, as she spat her curse upon them. Hear me, you who call yourselves just. May your longships founder in storm, your cattle sicken in the fields, your harvest turn to rot in your hands. May the mead in your cups sour on your tongues, and the Viking food at your feasts choke your throats. May your sons fall on foreign shores, and your daughters bear only grief. May the hollowed tree drink not only my husband's blood, but yours, until none remain to sing of your names. Her words rang out beneath the stars, raw and jagged, cutting through the silence. The people shifted, crossing themselves with old signs, whispering prayers to ward off the curse. Some spat upon the ground, others muttered that she was mad. Yet none dared silence her, for in her grief she had become something more than a woman. She was a vessel of fury, and to raise a hand against her seemed like striking a spirit summoned from hell. The outlaw moaned faintly, his head sagging, as if he too had heard her words. The ravens croaked from the branches above, their wings stirring the air, and many in the crowd took it as a sign that the gods themselves had carried her curse upward. The chieftain's face darkened, but he did not answer. To deny her would make her words stronger. To acknowledge them would give them weight. So he stood in silence, his jaw clenched, while the widow's voice lingered in the night like smoke that would not clear. When at last her strength broke, she lowered her arms, her body trembling. She spat once into the frozen ground, turned, and walked away without looking back at the man who had been her husband. The crowd parted for her as if for fire, none daring to touch her cloak. And long after she was gone, her curse hung in the clearing, heavy as the stench of decay, binding itself to the clan like a shadow that would not lift. The wind off the fjord carried the smoke far into the night, a black column rising against the pale sky. The hollowed tree, that vessel of torment, had been set alight. Flames licked its twisted trunk, gnawing upward, devouring bark and root until the very heart of the cursed wood split with a scream like breaking stone. The people stood in silence as the fire roared, their faces lit in flickering orange, their breath white in the cold air. No one cheered, no one spoke. The burning of the tree was no victory, it was an ending, and endings carried weight. The outlaw had long since gone, his body swallowed by worms, ravens, and rot, leaving behind nothing but scraps clinging to the roots. Yet the stench remained, a reek so heavy it seemed to seep from the earth itself. The fire was meant to cleanse it, to purge the clearing of its filth, but as sparks rose into the sky, many whispered that no flame could undo what had been bound there. Some said the tree itself cried out as it burned, the smoke curling like souls escaping, carrying the moans of every Viking man who had been broken within its hollow. Children clung to their mothers, trembling as they watched the fire consume the trunk. A Viking child whispered that he saw faces in the flames, eyes wide, mouths open in screams. His mother hushed him, muttering charms, though her own hands shook. Warriors stood stiff, their jaws clenched, their knuckles white around spear shafts. They had faced raiders and beasts, yet few dared step too near the fire, as though the tree might lash out even as it died. The priest of Odin lifted his staff, his voice rising above the roar of the flames. The vessel is broken, the gods are satisfied. Let the smoke rise to Asgard, carrying this oath, breaker's shame to the halls of the mighty. His words were solemn, but the crowd shifted uneasily, for though the tree blackened and collapsed, the earth beneath it seemed to pulse with heat, as if drinking the fire rather than resisting it. The skald raised his chant once more, his voice hoarse from nights of song. He sang of ashes on the fjord, of fire consuming the cursed wood, of sparks that danced across the sky like spirits freed. Yet even he faltered when the wind shifted and the smoke swept over the crowd, thick and choking stinging eyes and throats. Some claimed the smoke carried whispers, faint but sharp, the echo of moans that had once filled the clearing. Mothers clutched Viking children tighter, whispering prayers that the spirits would not follow them home. When the flames at last sank to embers, the hollowed tree was gone, reduced to a heap of blackened ash. The ground around it glowed faintly, cracked and charred. No birds sang, no beast stirred in the forest's edge. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hiss of cooling earth. The people turned away, eager to leave the clearing, yet none walked easily. Many glanced back over their shoulders, their faces pale in the moonlight, as though fearing the ashes might rise and follow. In the days that followed, the villagers avoided the place. No Viking food was ever eaten there, no games of children played upon the stones. Even the hunters kept their distance, claiming the air still carried the stench of rot long after the fire's smoke had faded. Some said they saw shadows moving at dusk, shapes that slipped between the stones like men half-formed. Others swore they heard faint cries when the wind swept off the fjord, cries that chilled the blood and silenced the tongue. The hollowed tree was gone, yet the ground bore its mark. The runes carved into the stones still glimmered faintly at night, as if fire smouldered within them. And though the ashes scattered into the fjord with the wind, whispers grew that the place remained haunted, cursed by the gods, and fed by the suffering it had held. To step there was to invite the weight of all those moans back upon one's soul. Thus, though the tree burned, its shadow lingered. Ashes lay on the fjord, but memory lay heavier still, and the people knew the cursed ground would never be free of the horror it had swallowed. The hollowed tree was long gone, its blackened stump rotted into the soil, its ashes scattered across the fjord by storm winds. Seasons had turned to years and years into generations. The village itself had changed. New longhouses rose, where old ones had fallen. New Viking children laughed where their grandfathers had once played. And the feasts of winter brimmed with mead and Viking food, as though sorrow had never passed. Yet in every hall, when the fire burned low and the night grew heavy, the tale of the Oathbreaker returned. It lived in whispers, in songs, in the silence that followed a skald's final verse. The horror had not faded, it had only deepened, sharpened by the edge of memory. Old men, bent with age, still spoke of it with voices hushed, their eyes darting toward the fjord, as if the cursed ground might still breathe upon the wind. They told the young of chains dragged through ice, of honey smeared upon trembling flesh, of knives that carved but did not kill. They spoke of the swarm flies, worms, beetles that turned a man into carrion while life still clung to him. And always they ended with the moans, the dreadful moans that rose beneath the stars, carried down to the village so that none could sleep. The children pressed their faces into their mothers' skirts, trembling, yet the tale was told again and again, for to forget was to invite its return. The skalds kept the memory sharper still. Their songs drifted across fjords, sung in mead halls far from the place itself. They wove the horror into verse that bound itself to every ear. In their chants, the oath breaker's torment grew larger than life. Ravens darkened the skies, worms feasted in uncountable swarms, and even the gods themselves turned their faces away. Warriors heard those songs and spat into the fire, swearing never to break oath, lest they share his fate. Women hushed their children with the verses, teaching them that loyalty was bread and betrayal was poison. Even far beyond the village, the tale became a curse, a warning sharper than iron. Time did not soften it. Instead, it gathered weight. The hollowed tree was gone, but the clearing remained empty, avoided by hunters and travellers. Grass grew thin there, and some swore the ground still stank after rain, a faint echo of decay that clung to the air. Others claimed that if one stood there at night, they could hear whispers beneath the wind, moans like those once carried across the fjord. No one lingered long enough to prove it. Children dared one another to step within the ring of stones, but none did, for the curse of the place was stronger than courage. The widow's curse, too, was remembered. Mothers repeated it in low tones when hardship struck the failed harvest, the storm that sank a longship, the plague that crept through cattle pens. They said her words still lingered, spoken to the gods, binding the clan to sorrow. Whether true or not, the people believed, and belief gave the curse its teeth. Thus the tale endured, not in ashes or stone, but in the marrow of the people. It was told not for delight, but as burden, as chain, as oath. A Viking man swore by it when giving his word, knowing that the weight of memory stood behind him. A Viking child grew with it ringing in his ears, learning before he could wield a blade that betrayal led not to death alone, but to something far worse. Generations passed, yet the horror was never forgotten. It lived in song, in whispers, in the haunted silence of the fjord. The people carried it as they carried their axes, their shields, their gods. The hollowed tree had burned, but the memory did not burn with it. It remained, sharper than iron, darker than night, an unspeakable horror that outlived the man, the tree, and even the clan, bound forever to the Northlands as a warning none could escape.